Anaconda Copper Hills, Montana, September 1894. The air, already sharp with the coming autumn, carried the acrid tang of the smelter stack and the clean scent of pine. On the slopes around the burgeoning mine, the sound of progress was the rhythmic thud of an axe and the whine of a saw. Men were building against the winter to come, raising log cabins with tight dovetail joints and stout foundations. All except for one man. Mircea Constantin was not building up. He was building across. At the head of Lost Creek Draw, where a fissure in a limestone outcrop created a dark, uninviting mouth, he labored not with logs, but with stone. He hauled fieldstone on a crude sledge, one rock at a time, from the scree field a quarter-mile below. He mixed mortar in a wooden trough, his hands chapped and gray. And he was laying a wall, thick and deliberate, sealing the entrance to the cave. The other homesteaders, men who understood the unforgiving geometry of a Montana winter, would stop on their way to check their claims and watch him. Silas Croft, a carpenter whose cabins were considered the tightest on the hill, shook his head daily. "It's madness, Jeb," he said to Jebediah Stone, a mason who was helping him notch logs. "The man's building a tomb, not a home. That rock will sweat ice from November till May." Jeb spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Worse, he's building on land he can't hold. That's a natural feature. He's not improving the plot. He's just blocking a hole." The most authoritative criticism came from Henry Yancey, the Anaconda mine claim auditor. Yancey was a man of ledgers and legal lines, whose job it was to distinguish legitimate homesteads from speculative squatting. He rode out one afternoon and watched Mircea fit a heavy gray stone into place. "Constantin," Yancey said, his voice carrying the weight of the company, "I feel it is my duty to inform you that what you are doing is likely claim trespass. Any improvement on a natural karst feature can be interpreted as an attempt to leverage a mineral entrance. The company's survey will almost certainly void your homestead bond." Mircea paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. He looked at the auditor, then at the half-finished wall. "Is whole?" he said, his English thick with the cadence of his native Romania. "I make wall, make home." Yancey sighed, a puff of condescension. "It's your bond to lose." He turned his horse. To the men gathered, he spoke loud enough for Mircea to hear. "The man is foolish. He'll lose his land, and his family will freeze for his trouble." The consensus was sealed. Mircea Constantin, the quiet man from the old country, was building a stone-plugged icebox, a monument to his own ignorance. What did this Romanian earthhouse digger understand about geothermal physics that these experienced, competent frontier builders, men who had survived a dozen brutal winters, had so completely missed? Stick with us, and I promise you will learn the simple yet profound principle of geothermal anchoring, a technique that can keep a space at a stable, livable temperature even when the world outside is 40 degrees below zero. If you've ever wondered how ancient peoples survived extreme climates, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments, what's the most unconventional but effective shelter you've ever seen? Mircea Constantin was not a carpenter. He was not a logger, a miner, or a farmer. He had never framed a roof or dovetailed a corner joint in his life. Back in the Banat region of Wallachia, he was a bordei supator, an earthhouse digger. His hands were not familiar with the grain of pine, but with the cool, damp weight of packed clay, the gritty texture of low soil, the sharp edges of subterranean limestone. His trade was not one of conquest over the landscape, but of conversation with it. He knew the language of the ground, how deep the frost penetrated, where the water table sat, and most importantly, the secret the deep earth held, a steady, unwavering temperature, a constant cellar cool that ignored the scorching summers and brutal winters of the surface. He and his wife Elena and their two small children, Stefan and Anna, had come to Montana with the promise of a homestead, a piece of land to call their own. They spent their first winter, the winter of 1893, in a standard-issue bunkhouse provided by the mining company. It was a single-walled cabin of rough sawn pine, a structure considered adequate by frontier standards. For the Constantine family, it was a torture chamber of cold. Mircea had never known such a relentless, invasive chill. The cold in the Carpathian Mountains was a sharp, clean thing, a force you could shield against. This Montana cold was a presence. It seeped through the walls, radiated from the single-pane windows, and poured down the chimney when the fire died. The memory of that winter was not a single narrative, but a series of sharp, sensory snapshots. He remembered waking to find the cast-iron skillet frozen fast to the top of the cold stove, a thin film of condensation having welded it solid. He remembered Elena trying to pour coffee from the pot an hour and a half after brewing it, only to find a thick crust of brown ice had formed on the surface. Most vividly, he remembered his son Stefan's woolen gloves. The boy had left them on a crate near the door, and overnight the moisture from his sweat and the snow had frozen them into two perfectly flat, board-stiff effigies of his hands. They had to be thawed near the fire for 10 minutes before his son could even begin to bend them. Elena, ever practical, had sewn sacks and filled them with straw to line the walls, but it was a futile gesture. They burned through their allotment of wood twice as fast as their neighbors, the small stove glowing a dull red almost constantly, yet the corners of the room never rose above freezing. They lived in a tiny bubble of warmth a few feet from the stove, wearing their coats and hats indoors, their breath pluming in the air of their own home. That winter, Mircea didn't just feel cold, he studied it. He watched how it moved, how it found every crack, every nail hole, every thermal bridge that connected the frigid outside world to their small, shivering space. And he knew the frontier solution, a bigger fire, was the wrong answer. You could not defeat this cold with fire. You had to hide from it. The conventional wisdom in the Anaconda Hills was straightforward: build tight, build with thick logs, and feed the stove. The failure of this method was considered a failure of execution, not of principle. If you were cold, your cabin wasn't tight enough. Your chinking was cracked, your wood was green. The problem, the frontiersmen believed, was the construction. The problem wasn't the construction. The problem was physics. A standard log cabin, even a well-built one by Silas Croft, was a thermal sieve. Wood, for all its solidity, is a relatively poor insulator. A 10-inch thick pine log has an R value of about 12. Modern insulated walls start at R19. But the logs themselves weren't even the primary issue. The real villain was thermal bridging. Every nail, every spike that passed from the outside to the inside became a miniature highway for heat to escape. In the biting cold of a Montana winter, these bridges didn't just leak heat. They actively siphoned it out of the structure. You could see the evidence on a cold morning, where a ghostly pattern of frost would appear on the interior walls, tracing the location of every single piece of metal fastening. The second enemy was air infiltration. No matter how tightly the logs were notched or how carefully the chinking was applied, a log structure expands and contracts. Thousands of tiny, invisible gaps open and close with the temperature swings. In the negative pressure created by a hot stove drawing air up a chimney, cold air doesn't just seep through these gaps. It's actively sucked in. A candle flame held near a wall in Silas Croft's cabin would dance and flicker wildly, revealing the countless tiny jets of Arctic air piercing his thermal envelope. To stay warm, he had to burn enough wood to heat not just the volume of his cabin, but also the continuous stream of 20 degree feet air that was being pulled into it. His family was essentially living in a tent with a bonfire in the middle. The fuel consumption was staggering. A cord of wood every 10 days. A constant, exhausting cycle of felling, bucking, splitting, and hauling that left little time for anything else. Henry Yancey's own quarters attached to the claim office were framed lumber, considered a step up. But the uninsulated wall cavities were filled with frigid air that convected endlessly, pulling warmth from the interior clapboards. The single-pane windows were coated in a half-inch of opaque, fern-like frost from November to March. He, like everyone else, accepted this as the price of living in a place where the earth itself seemed to hate warmth. They saw the problem as a battle to be won with brute force, more logs, a bigger fire, a thicker coat. They were fighting a war on the wrong front. In the late summer, while other men were chinking their walls for the coming winter, Mircea began his own preparations. He didn't look for logs. He walked the draws and ravines, his eyes not on the trees, but on the rock formations. He was looking for a specific type of limestone, one that signaled the presence of deep, dry caves. In the head of Lost Creek Draw, tucked behind a screen of scrub juniper, he found it. A dark opening, about 8 feet high and 10 feet wide, leading back into the hill. He lit a pine knot torch and ventured inside. The air grew still and cool, the smell of damp earth and stone replacing the scent of pine. The passage went back about 22 feet, ending in a solid rock face. The floor was mostly dry dirt and fallen stone. He held the torch up. The ceiling was a solid vault of limestone, and near the back a thin, dark crack snaked its way upwards, a natural flue. He held his hand beneath it and felt a faint, almost imperceptible movement of air. Perfect. He spent the next week clearing the cave floor, leveling it with a shovel and pick. He brought his wife, Elena, to see it. She stood at the mouth, peering into the gloom. Her expression was a mixture of deep trust and profound confusion. "Mircea," she said softly in Romanian, "our neighbors will think we are bears." "Bears are smart," he replied, patting the cool stone wall. "They sleep all winter. They are not cold." His real work began with the facade. He wasn't just blocking the hole, he was building a high-performance thermal barrier with the materials at hand. Using the field stone he hauled on his sledge, he began laying a double wall. The outer wall was thick and rough, designed to blunt the force of the wind. The inner wall was more carefully constructed, with stones chosen for their flat faces. He left a gap of about 6 inches between the two walls, which he painstakingly filled with dry soil and crushed juniper bark, a primitive but effective form of insulation. The final wall was nearly 30 inches thick, a fortress of stone and earth. He framed a single heavy door using salvaged timber from the mine, ensuring it fit into the stone jamb with less than a 1/4 inch of tolerance. For the flue, he purchased 20 feet of 6-inch iron stovepipe. With Stefan helping him, he carefully fed it up through the natural crack in the cave's ceiling until it emerged from the top of the hill, nearly invisible from a distance. The mockery from his neighbors was constant. Jeb Stone, the mason, declared the mortar mix all wrong. "He's using too much clay. First hard freeze, that wall will crack and fall to pieces." Silas Croft, the carpenter, scoffed at the door. "He set the jambs directly into the stone. The frost will heave that whole frame out of true by Christmas." And then there was Henry Yancey's official, looming threat about the Homestead bond. The auditor made it a point to repeat his warning to others at the general store. "Constantine is a stubborn fool. When the company surveyor comes through, he'll have nothing but a pile of rocks and a voided claim. He's investing his labor in a property he's about to lose." Mircea heard the talk. He saw the way the other men looked at him, the mixture of pity and contempt. He offered no arguments, no defense. When Silas Croft told him directly that his family would get lung sickness from the damp, Mircea simply said, "Deeper is dry." When Jeb Stone criticized his mortar, he just nodded. "Is what I have." He let their words wash over him. They were speaking the language of the surface, of wood and wind and fighting the cold. He was listening to the language of the earth, a slower, quieter, and much older tongue. His confidence was not in his own cleverness, but in the unchanging, fundamental truth he had learned as a Bourdais saboteur. The earth is warm. The principle Mircea Constantin was leveraging is known today as geothermal anchoring, and it is a cornerstone of passive building design. The science is both simple and elegant. The earth beneath our feet is a colossal thermal battery. While the surface air temperature in Montana can swing over 140 degrees Fahrenheit from summer to winter, just 10 feet below the surface, the ground temperature remains remarkably stable year-round. In the Anaconda Hills, at a depth of 28 feet, the average depth of Mercer's Cave, the limestone bedrock holds a constant temperature of approximately 49 degrees Celsius. This is the geothermal anchor. The 49-degree rock wasn't a source of heat in the way a fire is, but it was a massive, unmoving heat sink. In a conventional cabin, the floor and foundation are directly exposed to the brutal 40-degree air. The structure is constantly losing heat to the frozen ground beneath it. Mircea's home, however, was inside the 49-degree heat sink. The floor and the walls of his living space were perpetually trying to equalize with the temperature of the surrounding rock mass. The limestone was constantly, passively warming his home to 49-degree hours, day and night, whether the stove was lit or not. The 30-inch thick fieldstone facade was the second critical component. Its job was to prevent this stable interior environment from being contaminated by the chaos of the outside world. Its immense thermal mass, the ability of a material to store heat, meant that it took many hours for a change in the outside temperature to migrate through the stone. More importantly, it was an almost perfect air seal. With the heavy door closed, the uncontrolled air infiltration that plagued the log cabins was reduced to virtually zero. With the cabin anchored at a baseline of 49 degrees Celsius, the amount of additional energy needed to make it comfortable was shockingly small. A grown human at rest radiates about 330 British thermal units, BTUs, per hour, roughly the same as a 100-watt light bulb. 4 people, simply existing in the sealed space, were contributing over 1,300 BTUs per hour. The small cast-iron stove, burning just a few pieces of wood at a time, didn't need to fight a 40-degree gale. It only needed to raise a calm, stable 49-degree environment by another 20 degrees. The result was a home that could maintain a comfortable 65 to 70 degree hours interior using less than a fifth of the firewood of a conventional cabin. Mircea had eliminated the thermal bridges and sealed the envelope. He had stopped fighting the winter and had instead partnered with the mountain. That November, the winter arrived not as a gradual decline, but as a sudden, brutal assault. An atmospheric phenomenon the old-timers called an anaconda cold dome settled over the region. For 16 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above 34 degrees. A thick, metallic-tasting smog from the smelter stacks, trapped by the temperature inversion, filled the canyons and draws, pooling so densely that men claimed they could tell time by holding their pocket watch up to the ambient gray light at noon. The sun was a pale, distant disk that never managed to cast a shadow on the canyon floor. For the settlers in their log cabins, it was a state of siege. The world shrank to the few feet around their stoves. The battle against the cold was relentless. Every surface was icy to the touch. Water buckets left more than 5 feet from the fire would skin over with ice in minutes. The constant, high-intensity burning of the stoves coated the inside of the cabins with a fine layer of soot and filled the air with a choking haze. Silas Croft's youngest daughter developed a hacking cough that wouldn't go away. Jeb Stone's wife scalded her hand when a kettle of boiling water moved momentarily off the direct heat, flash froze to the stovetop and tipped over when she tried to lift it. They were surviving, but just barely, burning through their precious wood piles at an alarming rate, their bodies racked with exhaustion and cold-induced aches. Inside the mountain, the Constantine family lived in a different world. The thick stone facade was covered in a layer of wind-driven snow, adding even more insulation. The only sign of their existence was the thin plume of smoke rising from the iron flue pipe on the hill above. Inside, the air was still and quiet. The temperature held at a steady 68 degrees. The walls were cool but not cold to the touch and completely dry. There was no frost, no condensation, no biting drafts. The domestic rhythm of their lives was not just uninterrupted, it was peaceful. Elena cooked and baked as she always had. The smell of fresh bread, a scent of impossible luxury in the other cabins, filled the air. Anna and Stefan, dressed in simple woolen shirts, played on the floor, drawing on smooth, flat stones, with pieces of charcoal from the stove. The most telling proof of their comfort sat on a small wooden shelf near the back of the cave. It was a glass jar filled with a clear liquid, a plum tsuika Mircea had distilled the previous autumn. Every evening he would pour a small measure into a cup. The brandy was perfectly liquid, its temperature the same as the room's. He knew that in every other cabin on the slope, any bottle of moonshine or whiskey was now a solid brown block of ice that had to be chipped at with a knife to be consumed. Here, his family lived in a small pocket of perpetual autumn, protected by the immense, silent warmth of the earth. On the 12th day of the cold dome, Henry Yancey had business near Lost Creek Draw. A new survey had been run for a potential ore seam, and he needed to personally verify a boundary monument, a small brass cap set in a boulder. He rode out from the main settlement, his horse's breath instantly freezing into a white plume around its muzzle. The air was thick with smoke, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his pony's hooves on the brittle, frozen snow. He found the monument, brushed the snow from it, and recorded its marking in his ledger, his fingers growing numb inside his fur-lined gloves as he turned to remount his pony, skittish in the biting cold, shifted its weight. Its iron-shod hoof came down on a patch of sloped rock, a surface made slick as glass by a thin, invisible layer of frozen smelter grease. The animal's legs went out from under it. It went down hard, with a terrified squeal. Yancey was thrown clear, but his left leg was twisted beneath him. A sharp, searing pain shot up from his ankle. He tried to stand, but the joint wouldn't hold his weight. His horse, panicked, scrambled to its feet and bolted back toward the settlement. Yancey was alone, a mile from the nearest cabin, with a badly injured ankle and the temperature dropping as dusk approached. He began to limp, dragging his useless leg in the direction the horse had gone. Panic, cold, and sharp, began to set in. He knew how quickly a man could freeze in these conditions. Every step was agony. The thick, gray smog swirled around him, obscuring any landmarks. He was lost. After what felt like an eternity, a faint yellow light pricked the gloom ahead. It was a lantern glow, impossibly close. Hope surged through him. He stumbled toward it, crashing through the undergrowth until he found himself standing before a wall of stone, set into the hillside. Constantine's place. He half-limped, half-crawled the last few feet to the heavy timber door, his mind, conditioned by his own freezing cabin, prepared him for what he would touch. A surface coated in ice, a wood frozen so hard it would feel like iron, a cold that would sting his bare skin. He pulled off his glove and reached out, pressing his palm flat against the door for support. The sensation was so unexpected it made him gasp. It wasn't cold. It wasn't even neutral. The wood was warm. A gentle, unbelievable warmth radiated from it, the kind of warmth a piece of wood held after sitting by a fire for an hour. It was impossible. His own office door, a thick oak portal, currently wore a 3-inch ring of crystalline frost on its interior face. This door, exposed to the full fury of 40 degrees, was warm to the touch. In that single sensory instant, Henry Yancey's entire understanding of the world tilted on its axis. The mockery, the confident pronouncements of foolishness, the legalistic certainty, it all evaporated in the face of this simple, physical fact. He knocked, his knuckles making a solid, reassuring sound. The door swung open, and Mircea Constantin stood there, silhouetted by the warm lantern light. He was in his shirt sleeves. Behind him, Yancey could see the family at their table. He felt a wave of warm, dry air wash over him, carrying the scent of roasted meat. There were no drafts, no smoke, just a profound and impossible stillness. "Mr. Yancey," Mircea said, his voice calm, showing no surprise. "You are hurt." He helped the auditor inside, sitting him on a stool. Elena brought a cup of hot tea. Yancey looked around the smooth, dry rock walls, at the children playing quietly on the floor, at the jar of clear brandy on the shelf. The sheer, peaceful normalcy of the scene was staggering. He, a man of education and authority, lived in a constant, shivering battle for survival. This immigrant, this foolish man, had created a small, effortless paradise. Yancey took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through his chest. He looked at Mircea, his eyes filled with a dawning, overwhelming respect. "Constantine," he said, his voice raspy with emotion, "I don't understand. How?" Mircea simply gestured to the rock walls around them. "Mountain is warm," he said. Yancey shook his head slowly, a profound realization settling over him. He finally understood. "You didn't build a house to keep the winter out," he whispered, more to himself than to Mircea. "You just found the room where winter never comes." Henry Yancey became Mircea Constantin's most fervent advocate. The next day, limping on his bandaged ankle, he went to the Anaconda Company office and personally amended the survey report for Mircea's claim. He added a note describing the dwelling not as a karst feature obstruction, but as a subterranean dwelling of unique and highly effective geothermal design, officially sanctioning it. The threat to the Homestead bond vanished, but Yancey did more than that. He talked. He described the warm door, the dry air, the family in their shirt sleeves. His testimony, coming from a man known for his skepticism and precision, carried immense weight. The mockery that had surrounded Mircea turned to curiosity, then to outright awe. Men who had called him a fool now came to his door, not to scoff, but to learn. Silas Croft, the carpenter, stood inside and simply ran his hand over the dry stone walls, shaking his head in disbelief. Jeb Stone, the mason, examined the mortar he had criticized and found it perfectly sound, protected from the freeze-thaw cycle by the stable warmth of the cave itself. In March of 1895, a traveling correspondent from the Helena Free Press, hearing the stories, made the journey to the Anaconda Hills. He spent an afternoon with Mircea and a newly humbled Henry Yancey, taking copious notes. The resulting Sunday piece, titled "Old World Houses in New World Hills," was a sensation. It detailed Mircea's method, the stone facade, the insulated air gap, the stovepipe flue, and explained the simple physics behind its success. The article didn't portray Mircea as a genius, but as a man possessing practical, ancient wisdom that the new world had forgotten. The idea spread like a spring thaw. That summer, families across the hill country began looking at their land differently. They weren't just searching for flat ground for a foundation. They were looking for south-facing hillsides, for limestone outcrops, for natural depressions that could be excavated and enclosed. By the autumn of 1895, 6 other families in Montana had built variations of Mircea Constantin's cave dwelling, adapting his facade and flue design to their own terrain. The letters that reached the Helena newspaper spoke of winters transformed, of firewood consumption cut by 70%, of a level of comfort they had never thought possible. Mircea Constantin's humble home was a quiet revolution. It was a structure born not of engineering diagrams but of an intimate, generational knowledge of the earth. His design, using thermal mass, air sealing, and geothermal anchoring, anticipated the core principles of modern passive house construction by nearly a century. Today, architects and builders use advanced materials and computer modeling to achieve what Mircea did with fieldstone, dirt, and an intuitive understanding of the planet's thermal stability. His cave home stands as a testament to the idea that the most elegant solutions are often the simplest, relying not on complex technology, but on working with nature rather than against it. The story of Mircea Constantin is about more than just a clever way to stay warm. It is a story about two different ways of seeing the world. The American frontier ethos, for all its strengths, was often one of conquest. A forest was timber to be harvested. A river was power to be harnessed. A mountain was rock to be mined. The brutal winter was an enemy to be fought and defeated with a bigger axe and a hotter fire. The landscape was an adversary. Mircea, hailing from a much older culture, did not see an adversary, he saw a partner. His tradition had taught him that the earth was not a thing to be conquered, but a vast and complex system to be understood. He didn't build a fortress against the cold. He asked the mountain if it had a room that was already warm. His genius lay not in force, but in observation. He listened to the quiet language of the land and heard it offer him shelter. In a world of men who shouted at the wilderness, he was the man who chose to listen to its whisper. If you found this story of ingenuity and forgotten wisdom valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of practical history. We believe the past holds powerful lessons for the present, and your support helps us bring them to light. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices of earth-sheltered dwellings. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.